In a time filled with corruption, where many distanced themselves from God, Enoch was an exception. He chose to follow a different path, living righteously and maintaining a constant connection with the Creator. But what was this journey like? What did he do to please God so much? Get ready to discover a story of faith, mystery, and a valuable lesson about how to live a life that truly pleases the heart of God. After all, what made Enoch so special? The answer may transform the way you see your own spiritual journey. From the very beginning, the Bible shows us that Enoch was a remarkable man, someone who stood out because of his way of living. While many around him turned away from God and followed the path of disobedience, he made a different decision. He chose to walk with God. But what does it mean to walk with God? It is not like simply walking alongside a friend on the street. Walking with God means having a close relationship with Him, living in obedience, following His teachings, and trusting in Him even when things get difficult. It is choosing to live in a way that pleases God, with faith and dedication in everything you do. Now imagine what the world was like in Enoch's time, a place full of violence, selfishness, and idolatry. People were growing more and more distant from God, and almost no one cared about living righteously. In the middle of this scenario, Enoch was different, like a light shining in the darkness. He did not just believe in God. He placed His presence at the center of his life. Everything he did reflected his love and faithfulness to the Creator. Perhaps you ask yourself, how was he able to live this way in such a corrupt world? The answer lies in his dedication. Enoch sought God every single day. He prayed, listened to His voice, and obeyed with joy. His relationship with God was not something occasional but constant, like a strong bond that never broke. Saying that Enoch lived righteously means that he always chose to do what pleased God, even if it made him different from others. He did not follow the wrong customs of his time, but showed that it was possible to live justly and faithfully, even in a world full of wickedness. Enoch knew that walking with God required effort, humility, and courage. He understood that because of his faithfulness, he might be rejected or criticized by others, but that did not make him give up. For him, pleasing God was more important than pleasing people. His relationship with God was so strong that it changed the way he saw the world. While many thought only about money, power, and temporary pleasures, Enoch lived with a greater purpose, bringing joy to the heart of God. He saw God not as someone distant, but as a loving Father, a faithful friend, and a present guide in every moment. Now think about a friendship so strong that you do not even need words to understand what the other is thinking. That is how Enoch's relationship with God was. He knew the heart of the Creator because he spent time with Him, learned from Him, and lived according to His teachings. The story of Enoch makes us reflect. What does it truly mean to walk with God in today's world? For him, it went far beyond simply following rules or having religious habits. It was a way of life, a daily decision to put God first, even if no one around him did the same. His life shows us that even in the midst of challenges, it is possible to live in a way that pleases the Creator. Enoch was an ordinary person, but what set him apart was his choice to walk with God every single day. He lived in a way that every action demonstrated his faith, trusting God to guide him, protect him, and transform his life. By knowing his story, we understand that walking with God is not just a beautiful expression, but a calling to live with purpose, seeking a true connection with the Creator, just as Enoch did. The time in which he lived was not easy. The world was no longer as God had created it in the beginning, pure and harmonious. People had turned away from divine teachings, and sin spread like a disease, corrupting minds and hearts. It was a time of violence, selfishness, and disobedience, where many lived as if God did not exist and as if there were no consequences for their choices. During that time, idolatry was common. Instead of worshipping the one true God, people created images of stone, wood, and metal, believing that these objects had power. Pride took the place of respect for God, and corruption spread everywhere. The world was getting worse, heading toward destruction, and God was already preparing the judgment that would come in the time of Noah. But in the midst of all this darkness, there was someone different, Enoch. While many chose to live in sin and selfishness, he chose to walk with God. His life was like a shining star in the middle of the night, showing that it was possible to be faithful to God, even in difficult times. Beyond living righteously, Enoch also proclaimed the truth. In the book of Jude in the New Testament, we learn that he spoke about God's judgment against those who lived in sin. He did not remain silent in the face of injustice. On the contrary, he had the courage to stand up for what was right, even in a world where the majority was on the wrong path. He probably faced mockery, rejection, and even hostility, but none of that stopped him. He trusted God more than he feared people. The way Enoch lived was already a message in itself. He did not need to give great speeches or draw attention to himself. His life showed that he was different. Enoch was honest, just, loving, and generous, qualities that reflected the character of God. While many lived only to satisfy their own desires, he chose to live to please the Creator. Imagine how people saw Enoch in his daily life. He was probably a caring father, a trustworthy friend, and a neighbor always ready to help. His actions spoke louder than any words, making him a living example, even if many preferred to ignore him. At that time, the world was reaching a critical point. God, with patience, waited for people to change, but almost no one wanted to listen. Sin only increased, and God's judgment was near. However, before that, he wanted to show that there was a different path, and he chose Enoch to be that example. Enoch was like a light shining in the darkness. His life proved that God always preserves faithful people, even in the most difficult times. He was a clear sign of hope and also a warning. It was possible to walk with God, even when everything seemed lost. In Jude, chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, the Bible speaks about Enoch as a courageous prophet who announced God's judgment. He did not just live righteously, but he also understood that he had a special mission, to be a voice of warning to a people who ignored the truth. Enoch did not remain silent. He spoke about God and warned about what was to come. His message was clear. Look, the Lord is coming with thousands of his saints to judge everyone, to condemn the wicked for their evil deeds and for the arrogant words they have spoken against him. These words show that Enoch understood God's justice and knew that he would not let evil go unpunished. Speaking about judgment in a world that rejected God was not easy. Enoch needed a lot of courage, for he knew he would face mockery, rejection, and even the anger of those around him. But he did not let that shake him, because he was certain that God was with him, giving him strength and guiding his steps. Enoch did not live to please people, but to obey God. He knew that his mission was to speak the truth, even if it brought criticism. His warning was direct. The Lord is coming, and no one will escape judgment. The people in Enoch's time were rebellious, and probably many mocked his prophecies. Some must have questioned, who does he think he is to speak about judgment? Why should we listen to him? Others perhaps thought he was exaggerating, but none of this shook him. Enoch knew that his message came from God and not from himself, so he remained firm without worrying about criticism. The example of Enoch teaches us an important lesson. He did not choose the easiest path. He could have simply lived his life righteously and silently, without getting involved. but he understood that he needed to proclaim God's justice and was faithful to his calling, being a voice of truth in the midst of a world full of wickedness. As a prophet, Enoch had a great responsibility. He did not speak about judgment to condemn people, but to make them realize the seriousness of sin and to show them that there was still time to change and return to God. His message was not just for the people of that time. It remains a warning for us today. Enoch reminds us that God is just and that sin has consequences, but he also shows us that there is always hope for those who choose to walk with him. Enoch was an example of faith and courage. He not only lived righteously, but he also had the boldness to speak the truth, even when no one wanted to listen. His story teaches us to follow God's calling, even if it means going against the majority. Enoch's message remains clear even today. The Lord will come and bring justice. Like him, we too can be a light in the darkness and stand up for what is right, even when the world chooses the wrong path. The Bible tells us something amazing. Enoch lived for 365 years before being taken by God. That number may seem huge to us today, but the most important thing is not how long he lived, but how he lived. His life was not just long, it was marked by a constant and close walk with God. Walking with God goes beyond just believing or obeying from time to time. It means choosing to be with him every single day, even in the hardest moments. Enoch lived this way throughout his entire life. He did not just have a phase of faith or a period of obedience. His walk with God was steadfast from beginning to end. Now, imagine this. Year after year, Enoch chose to follow God. He did not give up because of difficulties, temptations, or the influence of those around him. He lived in a way that reflected God's love and holiness. His story teaches us that it is possible to remain faithful even when everything seems difficult. Enoch's relationship with God was not just about following rules or performing rituals. It was deep and real. He sought to be close to God every day, wanting to know him better, hear his voice, and obey his teachings. Think of a very close friend, someone with whom you can talk about everything, share joys and challenges. That is how Enoch's friendship with God was. He knew that he was never alone, not even in the hardest moments. God was his strength, his companion, and his joy. The Bible says that Enoch's faith pleased God so much that he was spared from death. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 5. Imagine that, pleasing God to the point that he did something unique in history. Enoch did not die. God took him directly into his presence. But what made Enoch please God so much? The answer lies in his firm faith and his constant obedience. He fully trusted God without needing proofs or signs. This faith was enough for him, and it was reflected in his actions. Enoch lived righteously, loved his neighbor, and honored God in everything he did. The story of Enoch makes us reflect on how we are living our own journey with God. Are we faithful and steadfast in our relationship with him? Do we seek to please God in everything we do? Enoch shows us that it does not matter how long we live, but how we live. This is the most incredible moment in the story of Enoch, the high point of his life with God. Genesis chapter 5, verse 24 describes it in a simple yet powerful way. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him away. Now, imagine this scene. Enoch, who for years lived in deep communion with God, experienced something unique. He was taken by God without experiencing death. There was no warning or explanation. He simply disappeared. No one found his body because he did not die. God took him for himself directly, as a special sign that he was pleased with his life. This moment carries a profound spiritual meaning. Being taken by God was not just about escaping death. It was a clear demonstration that those who live in obedience and faith are rewarded in an extraordinary way. For Enoch, this meant entering directly into the presence of God without pain or suffering. It was an act of divine grace, showing how God cares for those who seek him with all their heart. Being taken by God reveals something even greater, the promise of living forever with the Creator. Enoch was not only spared from death, but he was taken directly into the presence of God. This reminds us that just like him, all those who walk with God and remain faithful have the assurance of a glorious destiny. Even when we face problems and difficulties in this life, there is something wonderful awaiting us, the eternal life with the Lord. This special event also gives us a glimpse of what God has prepared for those who love him. Enoch was like an example for us, someone who shows us the way. He reminds us that our true home is not here, but with God. Enoch's life challenges us to live in a way that also reflects our faith, so that in the end, we too can be with God forever. The story of Enoch is not just about him, it is about all of us. It is a message of hope and an invitation to live in obedience and closeness with the Creator. God is always watching over those who seek him, and the reward for those who are faithful goes far beyond what we can imagine. Enoch's life is proof that it is possible to walk with God, even in a world full of difficulties. He teaches us that the greatest reward of faith is not something material, but something spiritual. Being close to God, living in his presence with peace, and having the promise of being with him forever. Enoch lived for 365 years, and every single year of his life was marked by faith, love, and dedication to the Creator. May we follow his example, walking with God every day of our lives, until the day we are also called to be with him eternally. Now tell me in the comments, did you already know the story of Enoch in the Bible? Share this teaching so that more people can be blessed. Do not forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel to follow more content like this. May God bless your life.